Welcome to Canterbury Trails, a weekly walk through the faith and culture of our Anglo heritage.
O Lord, our Heavenly Father,
England is first and foremost for us a home.
That which we are.
Thought not, fear no darkness.
One equal temper of heroic hearts.
grant that all our doings may be ordered by thy governance.
It's the man who's only thinking about doing a good job or telling the truth who becomes really original.
Made weak by time and fate, but strong in will.
And then all the host of Rohan burst into song, for the joy of battle was on them.
To strive, to seek, to find.
Through Jesus Christ our Lord.
And not to yield.
You have got to be happy in those quiet moments when you remember that you are alive.
Amen.
Hello everyone, and welcome back to another episode of Canterbury Trails. I am here this evening live with Father Ricky McCarl from the Good Shepherd Anglican Church in Harrisburg, and we have, I think, an interesting topic to discuss this evening. CJ is not with us presently, but he will be in just a little bit. So he had a meeting he could not get out of, but he expects to join us by around 9 o'clock to join this discussion. So if you're tuned in, it's probably because you have received some warning, forewarning that this episode was going to occur at this time, and so we're glad you're joining us. Spread the word. The comments are open. There should be going live on YouTube. Comments are open, and so please. Sorry, I had to just click a link there. So yeah, comments are open. So please, let us know questions, comments you might have. And so tonight we want to talk about this very controversial, although I feel it shouldn't be, topic of Israel, Judaism, and the corresponding charge of anti-Semitism. And the purpose of this is not to underhandedly suggest that anti-Semitism is okay. There is no dog whistles that are going to be used here. We don't. There is no extra agenda beyond having an honest conversation about the topic. And this is a topic, quite frankly, that I think there's very few honest conversations about it because it is so touchy. And so for those who do wade into the topic, they do so with a lot of fear of being labeled as anti-Semitic possibly. And if you get off the 3x5 card, if you get off the script, if you get off the narrative, it is very common. You will hear that charge. Somebody will use that charge of being anti-Semitic for straying from the narrative. I just want to be very clear to say that none of us on this panel, in this conversation tonight, have anything against Jews at all. So there is no secret agenda here. There is nothing that we are trying to push or to signal to anyone or any entity about negative stereotypes, concerning negative stereotypes towards Jews. But at the same time, we would like to respond to an article that has been published recently at the Christian Post talking about anti-Semitism as a heresy creeping into evangelicalism. So that is primarily where we are going to spend our time tonight, discussing this article and hopefully, in your mind, refuting it as well with solid arguments and evidence. As our listeners know, this is a podcast that is dedicated really to the cultural apologetic for Anglicanism. So that has been really the theme tying all of our episodes together so far. So why in the world are we talking about a topic like anti-Semitism or Israel? What does that have to do with an apologetic for Anglicanism or the English ecclesiastical tradition? Well, the reality is, like I mentioned, the article we're going to discuss was written by a prominent Anglican professor who is in our circles, someone I actually have a lot of respect for, someone who I have read his books and have followed. And I have a lot of good things to say about Dr. McDermott, who is the author of this recent article. But he is a prominent Anglican who has put a piece out there in public basically claiming that if you're not if you're not a Zionist, you're somehow anti-Semitic and anti-Semitism is heretical. And so we're not looking to stir up a fight. We're looking to kind of put ourselves in the clear and kind of shift the terms of this debate a little bit so that we're not speaking merely in tropes on this issue. So with that, I'm going to just kick it over to Ricky real quick to see if he has any opening thoughts before we pull up the article and we begin our discussion. Do you have anything you'd like to say to kind of set the tone?
Sure. I saw the article sometime last week through email, and I read it and was pretty appalled by it. I, too, have a great deal of respect for Dr. McDermott. Very happy to have him teaching at our seminary. But I was utterly astounded by the positions he took in that article, which read to me a lot like dispensationalism. Now, there have been a number of people who have said he's not a dispensationalist, and I'll take their word for it. But again, that, coming from a dispensationalist background myself, that's what it sounded like, and that concerned me a great deal. That's one of the reasons I left evangelicalism for Anglicanism, and to see it, in making inroads into our tradition is concerning to me. I will say, in regards to the accusations of anti-Semitism, we're kind of at a point now in our culture where that word doesn't really have any meaning. You can almost look at a Jewish person the wrong way and be accused of anti-Semitism. I just saw today there was a court decision where they stated that, burning the Israeli flag is a crime because it's a hate crime because it's anti-Semitism. It's the only flag protected now by federal law. I mean, you can burn an American flag and it's a First Amendment, and I have issues with that. I don't think we should be telling people they can go burn American flags. I don't think we should burn any flags. But that's a pretty bold decision on the part of the court, and I think it just highlights where we've come in terms of meaning of words and definitions. I am not an anti-Semite. I have a great love for the Jewish people. I want to see the Jewish people come to Jesus. Now, there are people who would say that because I want to see the Jewish people come to Jesus, that itself makes me an anti-Semite. And so some of that's just absurd. Having said that, there is true anti-Semitism out there. People burning crosses in front of synagogues, bombing synagogues, murdering Jews, all of these things. Those are things condemned by the scriptures. And one of the things that I said when this article came out is that we can condemn murder and hatred without entering into theological error about the nature of Jews and covenant. So I think that's kind of where I'm starting at. I'll also add, this has always been an important issue to me because my uncle, my aunt's husband, was a Palestinian and a Christian. And so there's a long history there. We may get into some of that tonight, that my dear uncle, God rest his soul, witnessed firsthand and shared with me as a young man, and it was appalling. And that's always kind of colored some of why I am the way that I am. But also theologically, there's some issues, which I think we'll talk about those too. But the bottom line here is that none of us are anti-Semites. None of us are promoting the persecution of the Jews. None of us are promoting murder. We condemn all of those things outright from the very beginning. So,
yeah, and I'll even go one further, in case there's the skeptic out there to say, well, good, don't pat yourself on the back. You don't want to murder the Jews. Oh, that's great. I think I'd go one further to say we don't believe that the Jews are the Jews are behind every bad thing that happens in the world either. So.
No, we blame Satan for that.
So I'll just, in case there's someone out there latching on to, oh, good job, they stopped short of, advocating murder of Jews. No, we'll do better. We don't believe that everything bad that goes on in the world is some Jewish conspiracy, or that they are some uniquely sinful.
It would be simply wonderful if people would just, not attribute motives to the things that we say, and believe that we are good Christian men who love the Lord and love people too, and want to see them come to know Jesus. That's what a world we would live in if people didn't just try to accuse you of terrible things all of the time.
Right. It would save us 10 minutes off the front of this podcast.
Absolutely, yeah.
Getting to the issues. So, okay. Well, with that said, I want to get into this article and hopefully get through at least most of it. And perhaps we'll take some detours in the middle of this as well. There might be some rabbit trails to go down. But this article will provide our... the main outline for where we're going to go with the rest of our time. So, okay. Dr. McDermott begins this article. By the way, this is found, the title is called New Antisemitism Rising Among Christians is Heresy. And this is at the christianpost.com. And so he begins by writing, heretics oftentimes cherry-pick the Bible, omitting what is inconvenient and connecting what is not related to advance an agenda foreign to the biblical witness. Marcion taught that the Old Testament God was different from God the Father. Arius taught that Jesus was created and a finite being. Pelagius taught that we're born without an inclination to sin, and some have actually managed to live without sinning. All of these heretics use the Bible to argue for their heresies. Today there's a new group of online influencers who use the Bible to execrate Jews and Judaism, contradicting the teachings of both Testaments. So right there, the narrative has kind of been set. There's Arius, Pelagius, Marcion, these great heretics in the early church, and those who... McDermott seeks to address are in this same group of those outside the faith for not agreeing with his Zionism. So the straw man that he sets up to attack as an example of this is Bible Church pastor Joel Webon, who he says is one of the loudest and most malicious of them all. He argues that the New Testament is not concerned with physical Jews, only with those who accept Christ. He cites Paul's statement in Romans 2 that no one is a Jew who is merely one outwardly, because circumcision is a matter of the heart by the Spirit. Therefore, Webon alleges we Christians are to put no stock in the flesh of Jews unless they accept the Jewish Messiah. Now, I'll start just by saying that while I know who Webon is, and maybe our listeners know who Webon is, Webon is not an Anglican, as he's as far as I know, unaffiliated Bible church pastor. I do not consider myself as connected in any way with Joel Webon. The fact that Joel Webon was attacked in this article by McDermott is not what provoked this response. We are not coming out to rally around Joel Webon, so I do not take responsibility for the things Webon says or doesn't say in his podcast ministry or whatever he does. That is not the motivation here. And again, I hate to keep throwing out all these caveats, but just because Webon said something else somewhere that may be more or less defensible does not mean I am here responsible for it. We're just going to deal with the quotes that are actually offered in the article here. Anything you want to add to that, Ricky?
Well, I didn't know who the man was until I read Dr. McDermott's article.
Okay.
I mean,
fair enough.
Much of that Reformed world is not doesn't register with me. So he was a new person to me. So I had to go and look up some of the things that he said. But it seems to me that what McDermott is confronting here in the very front end of his article is what he's doing with the biblical text. Cherry-picking passages to articulate a position that the scriptures do not actually articulate themselves. And as we've talked before in private and online, there are various different interpretations of Romans 9 and 11. It seems to me that those are being ignored.
Yeah, and in the what I read so far from Romans 2, I'm not really seeing a problem here with what Webon is saying, where when you say no one is a Jew who is merely one outwardly because circumcision is a matter of the heart by the Spirit. Okay, that's Paul.
That's like a direct quote.
Therefore, Webon alleges that we Christians are to put no stock in the flesh of Jews unless they accept the Jewish Messiah. Well, I don't think that's a crazy position. That I think because of what unites us is Christ. I don't see that it's there's an obligation that we owe to Jews because of their genetics apart from Christ, any more than I think there's an obligation we owe to Germans because they're German, or French because they're French, unless I am French. If you're English, and that's your heritage, that's one thing, but to say that people who are not my heritage, the Chinese across the world, do I owe something to the Chinese because they're Chinese? No. So he's already setting up the category that, and this is my point, that something is owed to the Jewish people because they're Jewish and apart from Christ. So, and to your point, which you introduced about, this sounds a lot like dispensationalism. I think that's right, because this is the category that's being set up. The question is, well, how dare you suggest you don't owe an obligation to the Jews outside of their embrace of the Messiah? Am I stretching here?
No, I don't want to get ahead here, but one of the big red flags for me is that he says that God has not rejected his people. That is a true statement. God does not reject his covenant people. God does not lie. God tells only the truth. But the problem with that is, who are the covenant people?
Right.
And if you read Paul in Romans 9, I'm looking at it right here. He's pretty clear that flesh and blood is not the thing that makes one a Jew. One is not an Israelite outwardly. They're an Israelite inwardly. They're an Israelite by promise. And so that totally conflicts with what St. Paul says in Romans 9. And so that was a major red flag for me too. But we're probably getting ahead of ourselves a little there.
Sure, that's good to lay that groundwork, because we're going to get further into Romans 9 through 11. So continuing on the article, McDermott accuses Webon of attacking Jewish character with shocking calumny. In a recent post on X, he pronounced that, quote, those of Jewish descent are generally marked by subversion, deceit, and greed. I'm sure, I'm not, again, defending Webon here. If he said that, I'd have to see the tweet in fuller context, but I wouldn't agree with that. In words that are light years from what Jesus and Paul uttered about Second Temple Judaism, Webon writes that the Jewish religion is parasitical. We have not heard such anti-Semitic invective since the mass rallies of Nazis in the 1930s. And right there, we're at Nazi. We've got one tweet, and we're at the Nazis. All right, so Christians who wonder why so many of the German churches look the other way when Jews started to disappear should take notice. I want to pause right there just for a quick comment, and please, anybody who has something else jump in, feel free to jump in. But just the idea that it is beyond the pale for Webon to write that the Jewish religion, again, which is not the Christian religion, not Jews, but the Jewish religion is parasitical, is something that's unacceptable. I've heard many Christian professors that I've sat under talk about the Islamic religion as parasitical, that it's a parasite off of Christianity, that it latches on to certain truths of Christianity and Judaism, and then just adds a little extra. But it's parasitical. It works off of a Christian kind of framework. So I've heard that charge made. So the idea that Judaism is parasitical off of Christianity, I feel like that's a claim that could and should be evaluated as whether it's true or false, and not something that should be thrown out and say, that if you say something like that, you're a Nazi from the 1930s. What about you?
Well, right. As soon as we start throwing the N-word around, we're shutting down conversation. As soon as you call someone a Nazi, you've completely ended the conversation, because nobody wants to be associated with Nazism. And so, unless you're that weirdo from the Stone Choir group, but nobody wants to be associated with that, and so that immediately shuts down any meaningful conversation. And so you're not actually dealing with what Webben has said. What is it, Godwin's law? It's a logical fallacy. And I expect better from a seminary professor than to lob logical fallacies out in an academic journal. Would I have used the term parasitical? Probably not. But I think we need to have a serious conversation about Judaism and how Judaism conflicts with Christianity. This whole concept. Now, this is one of those things that gets people into trouble, calling into question the Judeo-Christian ethic. Friends, Judaism and Christianity are different religions. Judaism is designed post-2nd century Temple Judaism to oppose Christianity. There is a great book I read in seminary called A Rabbi Talks with Jesus. And the rabbi talks about how Jesus isn't Jewish. The whole book is just kind of going through the ethical demands that Jesus places upon us. And he says, that's not Jewish. So, for example, he talks about adultery. Jesus says that if you are to look at a woman with lust, you've committed adultery in your heart. And the rabbi says, that's not Jewish. To my response to that is, I don't care. Jesus is the lawgiver. He wrote the laws. Don't quote the deep magic to me, Rabbi. I was there when they were written. That doesn't matter to me. But that's the point that I'm trying to drive home, is that modern Judaism is not Christianity. We don't have the same belief systems. They're very different. And I'm not saying that that's, a bad thing. It is what it is. But we can't pretend that we're all on the same page when clearly we're not. We believe that Jesus Christ is Lord, that he is Lord of all things. They do not. That's the bottom line. And that's not anti-Semitism. That's just the facts of the matter.
CJ. Oh, your mic's not on.
All right, can you hear me?
There you go.
Yes.
All right. I'm late and I don't have a mic. It's crazy. Well, thank you for having me on this wonderful evening. Yeah, if I could just jump in there for a minute. Whether or not it's technically parasitical is one thing, but I do think that this sort of union of Judaism and Christianity, especially in the 20th century, I think in some cases has actually taken advantage of America's Christian soil in order to accomplish certain political ends. So you could say it's parasitical in that, sense. They've taken advantage of the evangelical milieu in order to achieve, a variation, a variety of cultural and political agendas. And it's always funny because, like, on one hand, we're not allowed to critique Judaism as a separate religion, but whenever we do point out the fact that Judaism, by definition, is a rejection of Christ's claim to be the fulfillment and to be the Messiah. Whenever we say that, we are blamed for being having a certain ethnic position, and so it's kind of like a bait and switch, where you try to make these religious points, but then the only thing that they can focus on to critique you is not some religious argument, but it's actually accusations of racism, which is unfair, and it's a way to cheapen the debate. And like you said, you can bring up Nazism, and of course the last sentence in that paragraph, he says Christians who wonder why so many in the German churches looked the other way when Jews started to disappear. It's like, if you take this position on the Jewish religion and you just make a distinction between the Jewish religion and Christianity, well, then you're, it's probable that you're going to be one of the people that just looks the other way as Jews disappear. And he's obviously, he's citing you with, very evil images that we all have in our head in order to take a cheap shot. And I think that Christians, evangelicals, especially Americans, really need to move beyond this phase, because I think it's tired. It's theologically abusive, and I think it's irresponsible to the theological discussions that we actually need to have.
Yeah, and back to that parasitical point. I just thought of another example. I've said many times, I've had others who said, that Marxism is a kind of religion of its own, that it's a Christian heresy. It's a parasite off of Christianity as well. That never was deemed controversial. So I don't understand why, just simply saying, that certain religions borrow capital from other religions and kind of feed off of them. And I think, CJ, to your point, the Judeo-Christian notion has smuggled a lot of things in a kind of parasitic way. So again, that could be a separate debate of whether it's parasitical or not. But my point here is that I think a charitable reading of Webon using the statement parasitical would find that there's a legitimate use of that term without jumping straight to the Nazis. So anyway, Webon continues on. This is where we get into more scriptural references that we can highlight, do some exegesis here. So he writes, Webon's contempt for non-Messianic Jews would shock St. Paul, a Jew, who said his fellow Jews had zeal without knowledge, Romans 10:2, were nevertheless beloved by God because of their fathers, the patriarchs, Romans 11:28. St. Peter, a Jew, would say that Webon's malevolence is condemned by the God who shows no partiality and repudiates ethnic defamation. Acts 10:34. CJ, to your point about trying to make religious claims and religious differences, who said anything about ethnic? Like, we're right back here in the ethnic defamation. So, like every heretic, Webon omits much in the New Testament that is inconvenient for his thesis. For example, just 2 verses after Paul lauds circumcision of the heart, which is commended explicitly in Leviticus, Deuteronomy, and Jeremiah, he asks, then what value has the Jew? What is the value of circumcision? Much in every way. To begin with, the Jews were entrusted with the oracles of God, Romans 3:1 and 2. So Webon believes circumcision has no more value before God, but Paul disagrees, and just after Webon's misguided proof text. Now, this blew me away. So
this is bad.
Yeah, firmly convinced circumcision has no more value to God. Okay, and I recently, last year, wrote
the Bible says that.
Yeah, exactly.
Jerusalem Council.
Yeah, right. Exactly. So now I wrote a paper published at North American Anglican last year about the true Israel, in which I make the argument that, circumcision among Jews is still perfectly acceptable. I don't think Jews have to give up circumcision. I don't think they have to give up a lot of their cultural practices. It's just the only issue, as I see it, for Jews is thinking that does something to get you closer to God. Is really my only issue, that it does not matter to God. And so what he seems to be saying here is that Webon is wrong for suggesting that circumcision has no more value before God. And then before that, with the Romans 3 reference, he talks about the Jews have an advantage. They had much in every way. There's great value to being a Jew because they were entrusted with the oracles of God. What Paul is doing there is saying he had set up the Gentiles in chapters 1 and 2 and shows why the Gentiles are condemned before God without excuse, even though they did not receive special revelation. Because of the general revelation they received, they were condemned without excuse before God. Beginning in chapters 2 and 3, latter half of 2 and into 3, he shifts to the Jews to show that the Jews are also condemned before God because they had the law but did not follow it. And then by the time you get into the beginning of chapter 3, he says, so if both are condemned before God, what advantage has the Jew? Paul says, much in every way, because they were entrusted with the oracles of God. They had the special revelation. They had the law that the Gentiles didn't have. That was an advantage to them. So the point here, though, is not because the Jews received the law once upon a time, the Jews are therefore genetically superior throughout all eternity. The point is that they had a special advantage over the Gentiles, and yet both find themselves in the same place in Romans, needing to be saved and reconciled to God by faith.
Well, yeah. Yes. And the other thing, too, is the entire point of Paul's words about the Jewish people was that the entire purpose of the Jewish people was to be the soil for Christ. That was their entire purpose for the first 4,000 years of humanity, was to provide. They were the thing that kept the oracles of God alive until the promised time. Now, when Christ came, Judaism should have stopped forever. That was the point when the Jewish people should have recognized that Christ was the promised Messiah and that they had served their function as a people and joined together with the church. That was their purpose. They served their purpose. And so now, after Christ, that purpose that they had was historical. It's not this ongoing special carve-out that Jewish people have as an ethnic group. That was their purpose before Christ. After Christ, we're all on the same page. You're either united to Christ, you're part of the church, or you're not. That's the distinction now.
I have my Orthodox study Bible here, and there's a note on Romans 10:1 through 3. It says, Paul wishes nothing but good for Israel, but their zeal is not based in truth. If they had merely been ignorant in their rejection of Christ, then their offense would certainly be pardonable. However, theirs was more than ignorance, for it was not that they simply did not know Christ, but they were bent on establishing their own righteousness rather than submitting to the righteousness of God. In other words, they trusted in themselves and their works and rejected the way of faith when it was presented to them. Now, one of the concerns I have with what McDermott has said here is that he essentially makes two ways of salvation. Now, you make that criticism and people say, oh, that's not what he's doing. That's precisely what he's doing. He's saying that the Jews have one way to God and the Gentiles have another way to God. But Jesus was always the way to God in both the Old Covenant and the New Covenant. And by rejecting him and trusting in their own righteousness, they have cut themselves off from the covenant. There is no hope in circumcision. I'm sorry. That's all over the pages of the New Testament. Jesus himself points to this. The only hope of the gospel is in Jesus' death, burial, resurrection, and ascension.
Yeah, I completely agree. So continuing on this point, McDermott says, besides signaling that non-Christian Jews still have something precious, the oracles of God. And again, that going back to my point, they still have the oracles of God, so that makes it precious. Well, if you don't actually honor the law, the point of the law, who is Christ, the fulfillment of the law, you're missing the whole point. I mean, that was Jesus. That's Christianity 101. That's Jesus red letter stuff 101, is that I was the point of the law, right? Mm-hmm. So the fact that they still claim to have Torah but completely miss the point, do they really have the oracles of God, is a question worth raising. Anyway, Paul argues in this same letter to the Roman church that his, quote, kinsmen according to the flesh are, quote, Israelites and still possess, quote, the adoption as God's firstborn, and the glory, the covenants, and the giving of the law, the worship and the promises are still theirs. Romans 9, 3, and 4. Again, Webon misrepresents Paul. The Texas preacher claims Paul denigrates Judaism without Christ, but Paul exalts its gifts.
That's a terrible rendering of, like, he pieces all these phrases together into one narrative that has nothing to do with what Paul's saying. What Paul's really saying here in Romans 9.
Do.
Yeah. Well, I mean, it's the same thing that I could say, to my fellow Americans that are kinsmen according to the flesh. Like he's drawing this relationship, not because the Jews are some ongoing special people, but because Paul himself cares for the people that God has given by natural affection. And like that's the point of this here, is that it pains him to see his fellow kinsmen rejecting the Messiah.
And they do still have those things, but they've cut themselves off from it. Like, those things are still there. Those things are still available for them to access if they repent and believe the gospel.
Right. And but I get the last sentence, just what throws me. The Texas preacher, referring to Webon, claims that Paul denigrates Judaism without Christ. Again, I thought that this was just what everybody knew and agreed on, that Paul does denigrate Judaism without Christ.
Mm-hmm.
Jesus denigrates Judaism without Christ.
I just think, I felt like that goes without saying, but apparently if you denigrate Judaism, you're not allowed to talk about Judaism, even non-Messianic Judaism, even Judaism without Christ. And I mean, Paul, I think, uses really strong language. Paul, being a Jew, I'll just to kind of broaden, the position a little bit. I actually believe I read a book last year entitled A Jewish Paul, which is a very pro-Jewish reading of Paul. And I, to be honest, found it quite convincing. I really appreciated from that work the real Jewishness of Paul. And I think sometimes we lose the Jewishness of Paul. That he really is a Jew. That is his background. That is his training. He's drawing on these Jewish ideas and talking about what Christianity is being incorporated as sons of Abraham. That's really what Christianity is the Gentiles come in and become sons of Abraham. We don't turn our backs on Abraham, we come in, and I think that's a very important component that we should really grasp, even as Gentile Christians, that we're brought in, we're brought near. It's that Ephesians 2 language where the wall is taken down and from the court of the Gentiles, and we're brought near to join where the Jews could go, basically draw near, closer to the temple. We join them, basically. We claim the Jewish Messiah. I think all of that's great and good and valid, but apart from Christ, Judaism apart from Christ, yeah, I think Paul denigrates that.
Well, it's funny. It's funny,
I don't
Jared.
think there's any two ways about it.
Yeah, it is funny. The Texas preacher claims Paul denigrates Judaism without Christ. Well, lower in Romans chapter 9, in verse 32, he accuses them. He says that they pursued it not by faith, but as if it were by works. He's literally there in the same chapter critiquing the concept of Judaism without Christ. Right. So, to miss that is to miss the entire point of Romans 9.
Too, I would like to come back to Jesus' own statements about Judaism to the Pharisees and the Sadducees. Would McDermott call Jesus an anti-Semite when he calls the Pharisees a brood of vipers? Would he call Jesus an anti-Semite when Jesus says they're whitewashed tombs? I think that's a valid question. I mean, Jesus had some pretty strong things to say to the Pharisees, and I think it so did Paul. So did others. The church fathers had quite a bit to say as well. Are we going to say all of that was anti-Semitic? There are people who would, but they're not Christians.
Continuing on, Webon despises Jews who have not seen Jesus, but Paul has unceasing anguish for them. Romans 9:2. Webon suggests that God hates Jews and no longer counts them as his chosen people. Yeah, but Paul says they are, present tense, beloved by God because of the fathers, the patriarchs, Romans 11:28, and their calling as God's chosen people is irrevocable, Romans 11:29. Like every heretic, Webon tries so hard to promote his agenda that he has to twist the scriptures in order to do so. Comments there?
It sounds like what's the name of the guy with the blood moons?
John Hagee.
Yeah, it sounds like John Hagee. Israel's the apple of God's eye. Yes, that's true, but we're Israel.
Right. Well, what do you do with 11:28 and 29 if we say Paul is talking about the Jewish ethnic people that their calling is irrevocable and that God still loves them because of the patriarchs?
I think you need to read that with context of Romans 9, that not everyone who is of Israel is of Israel. And he uses the example of Esau and Jacob and Ishmael and Isaac. Not all those who descend from Abraham are of Abraham. So what you have in the early church is a remnant of the Jews believing in the Messiah, creating the early church. I mean, you have to remember, all 12 of the apostles were Jewish. St. Paul was Jewish. It is a Jewish church that we have been so graciously welcomed into. So this is true if you read it through the lens of divine election, that some are elect and some aren't. And it's not on the basis of genetic makeup or family lineage. It's on the basis of the promise, faithfulness, believing in the gospel. So that's how I would interpret the passage myself.
If I could press here a little bit, I want to be, just as fair as possible. So if I press here by reading Romans 11:28, where it says, "As regards the gospel, they are enemies for your sake." So, but as regards election, they are beloved for the sake of their forefathers. So, these seem to be Jews that are not Christians yet, because they are enemies of you, church in Rome. But the argument I think here from McDermott is they might be your enemies because they're unbelievers, but God, they're still elect and beloved by God.
I think it's important to remember that at some point St. Paul was their enemy, and that St. Paul came to know Christ.
So you would say that Paul is referring to a subset of Jewish people.
The whole context is about election.
Christian.
Yeah. The whole context is about divine election.
Good. And so I think that's fair. And one of the questions I raise when it comes to Romans 11 is, it's one thing to take these verses and deal with them seriously, but then when you turn them into the idea that all Israel, and I think maybe that'll come up in the article, this all Israel will be saved.
And I believe that. I affirm that as an Israelite.
But each of those words require some definition, right?
Yeah.
What does all mean? And so when you say all Israel will be saved, you think that the whole nation of Israel at some point is going to mass convert and join Christianity. The physical nation of Israel is going to all do that because all means all. Well, I think we should be clear on something. Whether you believe that, or you believe, as I think we all believe here, that that's not the case, for neither one of us believes all means all in the way you're suggesting it. Okay? Because you don't believe, Dr. McDermott does not believe, that every last Jewish person is going to be saved. Right? So, and this goes to your point that I'm getting at, that no matter how you frame it, whoever this all Israel is, it is a subset, right, of Jewish people as a whole. Because otherwise, you're going to have to go the universalism route and say that every Jew, every ethnic Jew in history, down through history, if they had a little Jewish blood trickling in their veins, they're automatically going to heaven because all must mean all, and we got to keep it literal, right? And I don't think Dr. McDermott believes that. So whether he believes that the Jews are going to convert en masse, and therefore we need to protect the nation of Israel because it's God's future chosen people, or it's a small group of Jews that are going to be the elect out of, those Jews in the first century or throughout history, none of us actually mean all. Right? So, or we don't mean it in that way. So, and I think maybe a better way to interpret it is all of the elect Jews will be, and I think that's the way you're using it, all of the elect Jews will be saved.
And this is a common debate when talking about the scriptures, because the scriptures also say that God does not wish that any should perish. Well, what does any mean? Does that mean that God's going to save all of the people and all of the world, regardless of what religion they were, regardless of what they did? No. And no Orthodox Christian believes that. They understand that God's talking about, or that the scriptures, rather, are talking about the elect. Now, I know, especially in Anglican circles, talking about election and foreknowledge and all of that stuff can be kind of scary because nobody wants to be a Calvinist anymore. That was cool in the early 2000s. Now something else. But it's there, and you can't ignore it. You have to deal with it one way or the other. And I think that's part of the problem here. I mean, when I initially linked the article on my Facebook page, I had a former seminary dean, Anglican seminary dean, who I respect greatly, comment and say that only a small group of Christians, a small slice of Christianity believes in covenant theology, and that's not what's being taught in Anglican seminaries. And that was dumbfounding to me. I was just shocked by that because what's the alternative? That dispensationalism that they're totally not,
Right. So you know what? I really thought about this a lot. Even just this past week, and I think I figured out the slip, and that is, nobody really wants to be labeled a dispensationalist. And even McDermott in this article says, this isn't dispensationalism. But, and most of the people I interact with anymore are not dispensationalists, but are still radically pro-Israel.
Mm-hmm.
Say, and then we'll kind of dismiss the dispensationalists, or like, whoop, get that off of here. Like, nope, can't use that against me. I'm not a dispensationalist. But here's where I think it gets tricky. It's just as bad, if not worse, I think, because what ends up happening is you go to Romans 11, and the idea, the interpretation of Romans 11 is that the nation, state of Israel, as McDermott will go on to say, is a protection for God's covenant people, not in the dispensationalist sense, but a people who will be saved in the future because all Israel will be saved. There will be this mass conversion of Jews into the church in the future. So as I got thinking about it, I thought, you mentioned Calvinism and election.
And I'm not a Calvinist, just to be clear.
Yeah. Yeah. So you mentioned Calvinism, though, and election, and what, Calvinism and election would be a horrible doctrine if we could actually know who was the elect and not.
Mm-hmm.
Right? So one of the things that tempers the doctrine of election in Calvinism is that we don't know who the elect are. So we believe that, if you're a Calvinist, that, or even a Lutheran, that God unconditionally elects. I mean, even Lutherans would say that, right? But we would say that we don't know who the elect are. Therefore, our approach in living in the world is to preach the gospel to all because we don't know who the elect are, right? We are indifferent and preach to all because God might have people in this city, to quote, Paul, right? In I think it was Acts when he was in Corinth. What this interpretation of Romans 11 does is says that if you're a Jewish person, you have like a little invisible cross over your head because you're a future elect. And just imagine that. Imagine if we could know who the elect were. That all the elect were marked out. We could see a cross over their head. Just think how we would treat them. No matter how horrible of person they were, we'd continue to minister to them because we knew they were elect, right? We knew God's going to save this person eventually. And other people, they might be the nicest person in the world and they don't have a cross, they're not marked out. We would say, it's not worth our time preaching to these people. There's no elect here, right? That's how we would act. But because of this interpretation of Romans 11, we turn into a quasi-dispensationalism because we say, well, the Jews are not, God's separate plan. I think McDermott would say that they're not, we don't believe in we're not affirming two peoples of God or a separate plan of salvation, but these people are the elect of God that we know. We might as well just start treating them like Christians now because they're going to convert eventually. Right? And even if that's true, who's to say, like, let's say that interpretation is correct, that doesn't mean, though, that the Jews living today are going to be the ones that convert en masse. What if it's 500 years from now? But what we end up doing is we treat individual Jews or the nation of Israel as if they're halfway in. They're already elect. They just haven't made the final decision yet. So they get treated like quasi-Christians anyway, and I think that's where the slip is. Going back to the beginning of this conversation, you were very careful, Ricky, to talk about these are two different belief systems. One rejects Christ as Messiah, the other does not. We need to be very clear about that. How do you bridge that gap in this and make it work? In McDermott's worldview, is you say, yes, these are two different religions, but these are elect people that are halfway in anyway, so we might as well extend the courtesy, the right hand of fellowship as Christians, because they're halfway there, right? Because they're already chosen of God. Treat them like you would a person who's about to get saved tomorrow, because they're already elect. Does that make sense?
Or you just call anyone who disagrees with you a heretic and a Nazi and then move on. Not to be polemical, but that's what he did.
Right.
not to derail this conversation into geopolitics or anything, but this is really the rub for me, because there is an invisible sign in which God puts upon his elect. We call it baptism.
Yeah.
And you have thousands of these baptized Christians living in the Middle East being treated like utter dirt, both by Muslims, Jews, and the American government because of Zionism. And that's always just struck me as super odd, very bizarre, never really understood how we could get behind that.
Well, okay, so maybe I'll just keep reading then for a little bit. I think we're at Webben claims the Jews of modern Israel have nothing to do with biblical Israel, and alleges that the Jewish state is made up primarily of Ashkenazi Jews whose DNA does not match that of New Testament Jews. Both of Webben's allegations are wrong. Misra Jews from North Africa actually slightly outnumber Ashkenazi Jews, and tests have shown that the Ashkenazi Jews do indeed have DNA proving links with first century Israel. I don't know if you guys have any comment on this. I don't.
Yeah, actually, I do. Just real quick, there's something I learned. Do you remember the Tom Woods the show, the Contra Krugman show that he did with Murphy, right? So and one of the things they always said about reading Krugman's columns in the New York Times was to click the hyperlinks, because Krugman would always hyperlink to stuff, and that supposedly backed up his position, and most people wouldn't bother to click the hyperlinks. It's like, I don't have time to read all that. Well, if you click the hyperlinks, you often call Krugman's bluff, because there's not really much there. So I clicked the hyperlink, and what it hyperlinks to is a paragraph in a Wikipedia article that says the following: a 2017 study by Zhu et al., this whatever the organization, I don't know which organization is doing this, sounds Chinese, running different tests on Ashkenazi Jewish genomes, found an approximately even mixture of Middle Eastern and European ancestry, and concluded that the true fraction of European ancestry was possibly about 60%, with the remaining 40% being Middle Eastern. The authors estimated the Levant as the most likely source of Middle Eastern ancestry in Ashkenazi Jews, and also estimated that between 60 and 80% of the European ancestry was Southern European, with the rest being likely Eastern European. So I read that several times to make sure I was understanding it correctly. And I think I am. And basically what that amounts to is saying Ashkenazi Jews are about 60% European, 40% Middle Eastern. Now, that's hardly a ringing endorsement for the statement that was made. Webben claims that Ashkenazi Jews, their DNA does not match New Testament Jews. That's the claim. And McDermott says Webben's allegation is wrong. And Ashkenazi Jews do indeed have DNA proving links with first century Israel. Technically, that is correct. They do have links but according to the own hyperlink from a Wikipedia paragraph from this study that was done in 2017, you're basically saying, yeah, but they're still less than half Middle Eastern by DNA. Which, again, that Webben might be engaging in hyperbole there, and going too far, but that's hardly a refutation of his point to say, well, the science proves that, well, they're still less than half Middle Eastern Jewish, then still mostly European. That's my point there, is that that's not really a ringing endorsement of your position. So while Webben probably made an overstatement and said there's no connection between them, and there is, the point remains that there's a lot of European influence in terms of the Ashkenazi Jews, not only genetically, but culturally. So before we went live, I was talking about the Daryl Cooper podcast, Fear and Loathing in the New Jerusalem, where he talks about this a lot in the first couple episodes, that the Jews who went back to Israel, right around the end of the First World War, they started coming back. Most of these people are European culturally, and they're moving into spaces where the culture is primarily Middle Eastern. There's a cultural clash there. And I think most Americans just think Jews are Middle Eastern, these Jews just came back to their homeland. But in reality, these are people culturally who are European, who haven't been there for hundreds, if not thousands of years, who are moving in and saying, oh, this was our land 2,000 years ago, and just kind of pushing people off of it. And Cooper, if you've ever listened to Cooper is very fair. He's, he doesn't have an agenda against anybody. He was very fair in depicting the awful conditions that Jews suffered in the pogroms in the late 1800s, early 1900s in Europe, and why they would want to get out of there and go back and establish a nation for themselves. That's very understandable. But at the same time, the idea that you can just come in to a culture, you are a kind of foreigner to that culture, and say, I've got a land claim because 2,000 years ago or 4,000 years ago God gave me this land, I'm just going to move people out. Like, that just doesn't fly either. And you need to be able to understand why people there are saying, like, you got a 4,000-year-old deed? That doesn't really cut it. And so on this point, I don't think McDermott does a good job of refuting the point that even if they do have some ancestral DNA, the idea that all Israel will be saved, does that mean, what's the percentage? Does 40%, people with 40% Jewish Middle Eastern DNA, do they get in? Do you need a 50%? I have 1% Ashkenazi. I'm 1% Ashkenazi Jew. So does that mean am I an inheritor to these promises? Like, how far does this go?
You just get a quarter acre.
But, does God, obviously I'm a Christian, but, for other people, say it's a non-Christian, 1%, you do your 23andMe or Ancestry.com and find out you're 1% Ashkenazi Jew. Does that mean, you're part of the elect? That all Israel will be saved? That's part of the absurdity in this when you go down this route. Because it's not clear. It's not, this segmented group of people. These are people that have a long history, many different, not only genetic influences, but cultural influences what about if you're a converted Jew? Is Ivanka Trump now an inheritor to the promises because she converted to Judaism? How far does this go?
Not to get too far into this conversation of ethnicity and race and whatnot, but I think we can apply that to our own situation with the Native Americans. Nobody really wants to do that, but if we're being consistent, our Native American friends have a much better claim to this land than the Jewish people do. And so I sometimes think, how would I feel if the British government came into America and said, we're going to give your house and your land that you spent all of your money and your time and your effort on, that land that you love, we're going to give it back to these native peoples because it really truly belongs to them. That'd be a pretty hard pill to swallow for anyone. And that's precisely what happened. There was a great interview with Tucker Carlson the other day. He was interviewing an Orthodox nun that lives in the West Bank, and she was talking about how, there was this man and his brother calls him up and he says, they're ripping out our olive trees. And he gets there and the Israeli army's there ripping out all of these olive trees that they planted because they're taking their land and giving it to a Jewish family. And so they, gathered up their olive trees and took them to their new house and planted them, which, speaks to the fight in the Palestinian people, the courage of the Palestinian people. And they take those, trees and plant them at their new house. But imagine how that would feel. Like, imagine what that would do to you. And after pretty close to 80 years of that, that's something I don't think a lot of people consistently think about. And I'm not saying what the right answer is. I've been to Israel twice, and I recognize that if it were not for the Israelis, that would probably be a third world country that none of us would go to visit. I've enjoyed my time there. I find the Israeli people to be very warm and welcoming, opposed to European countries, who hate Americans. I'm just simply saying, like, if we consistently think about what that's done to the Palestinian people, I think we might understand them a little better.
So, since we've been going about an hour and 7 minutes, I want to get through the last part of this article, as it's getting a little late. So going down to, let's see, beyond the DNA point that we discussed a bit, McDermott writes, Webb proclaims proudly that the state of Israel is not biblical Israel. Again, I thought this was something we all knew and agreed on. Not really a surprising statement. This, however, to McDermott, is a straw man. It's not a claim that most Christian Zionists make. Instead, the new Christian Zionism, which McDermott is representative of, is more subtle but biblical. That the state of Israel is a necessary protection for the covenanted people, whose return to the land in the last 3 centuries fulfills biblical prophecy. Now, I catch the subtle distinction here, that Israel, the dispensationalist, would say that the nation of Israel is the biblical Israel. McDermott seems to be suggesting, no, we're not conflating the two, but the nation of Israel is the necessary protection for the biblical Israel, which still is the people that live within that nation state, is what he seems to be suggesting. But in terms of its relationship with dispensationalism, he obviously would agree that this creation of a nation state is a fulfillment of biblical prophecy, which is exactly what the dispensationalists believe. They read in 1948 and the events surrounding that into their Old Testament prophets.
Yeah, that's just classic dispensationalism. I mean, I don't really see a meaningful difference between what he's saying there, that the state of Israel is a necessary protection for the covenanted people who's returned. Like, he doesn't get more dispensationalist than that.
Well, I would say, I would grant him the distinction that it's a nuance, but it is not saying it's a one-for-one. Like, the Jewish state today, the Jewish government under the Likud party, Benjamin Netanyahu, is not the Israel of the Bible, but it is in God's providence, and something that is created in order to protect the true Israel, which are the Jews that happen to live in that space. I'm willing to grant that distinction. I don't agree with it, but I'm willing to see the distinction there. But I think the distinction cancels out. It kind of disappears when you say the same as a dispensationalist would, that when we read our Bibles, I've been preaching through Zechariah lately, that when we read our Bibles, we need to find the events, in the 20th century for their ultimate fulfillment. And to me, that is dispensationalism, to your point.
That's what I was getting at.
So, all right. So I'm trying to be as fair as possible, because I think some of this is ludicrous, but I'm trying to find agreement where I can. So he continues on. Even the New Testament prophesies that the Jews will return to the land from the four corners of the earth. In his second speech in Jerusalem, delivered after Jesus' resurrection, Peter says there is still to come a future apokatastasis, okay, pardon my Greek, using the Greek word in the Septuagint, the primary Bible for the early church, for the return of Jews to the land from the four corners of the earth. And here he cites Acts 3:21. For Peter, then, the return from exile in Babylon did not fulfill the Old Testament's prophecies of return, nor did Jesus' resurrection. There was a future return to come, and we know this did not happen for another 1800 years. And the return he sees Peter in Acts 3:21 speaking of the UN Declaration in 1948. Again, that's just dispensationalism to me. Historians agree that a massive return of Jews to the land began in the 18th century. Webon and his cohorts, such as Calvin Robinson, who has heroically fought for biblical truth elsewhere, but sadly endorses Webon's diatribes, ignore Peter's prophecy. They also ignore Jeremiah 31, where God says that as long as the sun, moon, and stars remain in the sky, the Jewish people will always be a nation before him. The implication of their claim is that God changed his mind about his promise, which would mean that Jesus was wrong when he proclaimed in Matthew 5:17 and 18 that every stroke of the pen of the Old Testament is from God. I'll stop there and let anybody comment, because that is, again, the dispensationalism argument that I knew growing up, that we must believe that the Jews have a physical nation again, otherwise we can't trust the Bible.
I have my issues with Father Calvin Robinson and some of his perspectives on things. But I think what this highlights, Calvin Robinson's over here and Webben's over here, and they're in an agreement. And we're somewhere here in the middle in agreement with both of them. I mean, I guess my point is that this is the position of the ancient church. Maybe they wouldn't have said parasitical and things like that. They might not have gotten into conversations about race and ethnicity, but the position of the ancient church. I mean, I look at my Orthodox study Bible and I read the commentary in there. The position of the ancient church is that the church is Israel. That God has opened up the covenant to Gentile people, and that we are children of Abraham, not ethnic Jews, just because they're ethnic Jews. I think that's kind of the takeaway from that. I'm sorry. I think McDermott's in left field on this one. Truly bizarre.
And I think the other point to be made here, just for apologetic purposes, what do you do with Jeremiah 31? Is Jeremiah 31 saying, which, if I recall, is the main New Covenant passage, of the Old Testament, Jeremiah 31, is Jeremiah 31, as the dispensationalists say, a prophecy about the physical nation of Israel or about the true Israel? And if it is a prophecy about the physical nation of Israel, and God promised as long as there is sun, moon, and stars, Israel will never cease to be a nation. If that's really what he's saying, then what did God do for 2,000 years, or 1,800 years at the very least? Because Israel wasn't a nation from what? 100, what's the cutoff date we want to use in the 2nd century, down to 1948. So if you're going to say that 1948 and that this nation of Israel is a fulfillment of prophecy because God said Israel will never cease to be a nation, what was God doing for that almost 2,000 year window when Israel wasn't a nation and they were scattered all over? So if God did not violate his promise, assuming it was a promise to the Jews, if God did not violate his promise during the Middle Ages, during the early modern period when there was no Israel, up until 1940, if that was not a violation of his promises, then why is God obligated to ensure that there's a nation of Israel now. If he didn't violate his promises in 1517, the year of the Reformation, and there was no nation-state of Israel, or in 1776, when there was no nation-state of Israel, or in 1860 or whatever date, or 1900, then why is it now that we are obligated as Christians to have a nation-state of Israel? And if we don't, God's not keeping his promise. God must have a nation-state. I just don't think that argument holds just for those, just on the basis of logic either. So, anything else on that before I continue on? We're probably not going to get to the end of this, but I at least want to wrap up this section, and just where he's dealing actually with Scripture. So he says, Webon and his allies cannot afford to acknowledge other critical New Testament evidence that undermines their distortions. Most importantly, the land promise in the apostolic documents. The Hebrew Bible says explicitly or implicitly 1,000 times that God gave the land of the Canaanites to Abraham and his progeny. And at least 3 times, the New Testament repeats this promise. The author of Hebrews says God led Abraham to a place to receive as an inheritance, and that Isaac and Jacob were heirs with him of the same promise. Before his martyrdom, Deacon Stephen said God promised to give Abraham this land as a possession and to his offspring after him. Paul tells the synagogue at Antioch of Pisidia that the God of this people Israel chose our fathers, and after destroying 7 nations in the land of Canaan, he gave them their land as an inheritance. And so all of these passages, Stephen's speech in Acts 7 and all of it, is being used to say this guarantees that Israel as a nation state, must exist as a fulfillment of prophecy, and that this land belongs to them. Any comments on that?
Yeah, my only comment here is that, most of Christian history has completely disagreed with this interpretation of things. I mean, this is the way, even just the classic run-of-the-mill Reformed, Anglican, even Catholic, interpretations see all over this passage, these land promises, in various ways. But, one of the most prominent ones is that they were already fulfilled, before Christ, actually, that Abraham, the promises to Abraham, regarding the land were already fulfilled. But the point is not even that, that's the right perspective, but just that Joel is not pushing something new and innovative here at all. And I think that's the thing that I would center on, is that he says Webben and his allies cannot afford to acknowledge. It's like, look, this is the entire, mainstream tradition of the interpretation of these promises. And so you can disagree with them, but you are disagreeing with a lot more than Webben here. And this has nothing to do with Webben's agenda. It has nothing to do with, rising animus against Jewish people here in the 21st century. It has nothing to do with this. This is a well-documented, well-trodden path of theological interpretation.
Yeah, and I would say also that talking about this land idea, that this land belongs to them, I think I see it as a kind of going back to types and shadows kind of thing, because the purpose of that land, that strip of land, was to be the foundation or the focal point that from which the gospel of Christ would be launched to the whole world. Right, so if you go to, even in the Psalms, this is talked about, Psalm 72, one of my favorite Psalms, it's David's basically prayer for his heir, Solomon. And the vision of the kingdom is not just to hold this strip of land, but to go to the ends of the earth, right? The kingdom of God is to go to the ends of the earth, and Israel is that first step, that where God covenants with this one group of people who is to shine the light of God, His law, His perfection, His holiness, to the ends of the earth, and to bring about the Messiah, who is the Lord of the whole earth. So the idea of going back and saying, to be biblical, we need to focus back on the land, is like saying, well, we need to go back to the sacrifices. The land, the strip of land, was not the point. The point was for these people to take over the whole earth. And by these people, I mean those who belong to the Messiah, whether Jew or Gentile. And so I don't get this argument about, well, it was promised to us 1,000 times in the Old Testament. Well, the whole vision of the Old Testament is you're not going to just have a strip of land. From the rising of the sun to the going down the same, all peoples will be praising the God of heaven and earth, Yahweh, because his name will be known by all, and he will rule the whole earth. And so I think it's way too small thinking to say, well, we got to fight for this strip of land because of the Old Testament.
It seems to me that what's not taken into account here is the resurrection. Maybe we need to read N.T. Wright, Surprised by Hope, one of his better works. Highly recommend it. But, I mean, one of the problems that American Christianity's had for a long time is this Gnostic idea that when we die, we go to heaven and we have this disembodied existence in heaven. And that's the end of all things. But that's not what the Scriptures teach. The Scriptures teach that there will come a day when Christ will come again, raise the dead, judge them, and then establish his kingdom once and for all upon this earth. Jesus says, the meek shall inherit the earth. He's talking about that covenant promise to Abraham, and he's applying it to all those who have put their faith and trust in Jesus Christ, Jew and Gentile. So we're not talking about this little strip of land the size of New Jersey. We're talking about the United States, Europe, Asia. We're talking about the whole thing is going to belong to the people of God, and they're going to rule and reign over it in the way that they were always meant to be. And I sort of feel like that's kind of missing here. I don't want to get into what McDermott believes about end times. About that particular aspect of end times, rather. But that Gnostic approach is definitely at play in a lot of the conversations around Zionism and the Jews inheriting the land. So I think that's something we need to take into consideration as well.
All right, so let's wrap up with this. The rest of the article, he goes after Candace Owens as an anti-Semite and brushes off the idea that there's any genocide being committed in Palestine by quoting some colonel somewhere. And I have not found... I think that's a topic for another time. Not really for this one, but I have not found those who are dismissive of genocide very often having a very close relationship with the facts of the matter. And it's just like, well, of course that's not happening. But that is going to be a much longer conversation, and maybe not even for this podcast. But that's really where he ends the article, is that, the nation might not be perfect, but there's no real wrongdoing going on here. So dismiss that and then go back to where he started, referring to Pelagius and Marcion and heretics. To wrap up, I would say that he really has not made his point here in terms of heresy. What council has condemned this position? In fact, what you're going to find, and having read his book, a book I enjoyed very much, which was The New History of Redemption, I think that's a very good book. I enjoyed it. But he would even acknowledge in that book, many of the church fathers, he would accuse them of being too influenced by the Greeks and not enough by the Hebrews, and didn't see all this and get this. So where is the council? Where is the judgment from the early church, the church of the Middle Ages, the church in any age, that, to CJ's point earlier, that, whatever Webon, might be saying or not saying, this is not, brand new stuff. Where am I condemned by, a pope, a council, anything, for saying, I don't believe that there will be, a huge influx of Jews. Now, if there are, great. I think that would be wonderful. I'm not against that. But am I required, going back to the 39 articles, Article 6, am I required from Scripture to believe that the nation of Israel, as constituted today, is God's protection for this covenanted people until the time that they mass convert to Christianity? Am I required to believe that? I don't think I am. I don't think there's any standard you could point to say that I am. So again, going back to where we started, the point of this whole podcast is not to create controversy or sow division by picking a juicy topic like this, but actually to promote peace, to say maybe we shouldn't be calling those who hold positions that have been held throughout the history of the church heretics and anti-Semites. We're not trying to be edgy here and bring up an edgy topic and create controversy and division. On the contrary, we are trying to pursue peace and push these divisive kinds of articles, as McDermott wrote, without a whole lot of substance, away, so that we can all get along and maintain the unity of the faith on those core things that are required to be believed.
My last comment would be, we didn't get to the whole article, but there's a section a couple paragraphs from now where he says, like Marcion, like Arius, like Pelagius. I mean, that's just lazy throwing everything at the wall to see what sticks. I mean, he has this point to make, and he wants to call Joel a heretic for having these very basic Catholic views of the dynamics between Judaism and Christianity. And so at the end of the day, he's just going to throw up, the major heretics of Christendom and associate Webben. And I think that's it's not just cheap and unfair, but it's kind of juvenile, if I could make that point, to just, take some people like Arius and Pelagius and associate Webben's, views with those things. It just doesn't seem like that's a useful or productive way of, dealing with these issues.
And I just want to add my encouragement to young men who are thinking about these things, not to become, as they say, black-pilled on the Jews. It does happen where young men start to blame the Jews for all of their problems. Your problems aren't their fault, my friends. They're yours. You got to work harder. Got to trust God more. I don't think we need to resort to theological error to deal with that issue, though. The Bible has clearly stated, "Thou shalt not kill. Thou shalt not commit murder. Thou shalt not covet." Those are pretty straightforward commands. And Jesus says that when you're angry with your brother without cause, you've committed murder in your heart. And so we need to make sure that our hearts are right, that we're, taking credit for our own failures, our own problems, not trying to blame them on other people. But that doesn't mean that we need to embrace fully the dispensationalist worldview. There's a lot of nuance in all of this. And when we start calling one another heretics and Nazis, we don't get to the nuance. It just completely shuts things down. And so we need to take a step back and have a legitimate conversation about these things without the polemics, without the vitriol, without the hatred. That's just how it has to be.
Well said, and that's a good note to close on, and we're at an hour and a half, so it's 10 o'clock on the East Coast. Let's leave it there, and perhaps based on feedback we might get, we might revisit this another aspect of this issue in the future. But Father Ricky, thank you for joining us. It really was a pleasure, and maybe we'll have you on to talk again about another issue in the future. So for us here at Canterbury Trails, have a good night, everyone, and we'll see you hopefully next week. Take care.
Good night.
Thank you for joining us this week on Canterbury Trails. If you like what you hear, we'd appreciate your support by liking, sharing, and subscribing on whatever platform you're hearing us. Stay tuned for more weekly episodes, and we'll see you next time on the Canterbury Trails.